So, I hope you're ready for some more Limbo combat tricks, because I've got some interesting ones for you today. Like the first two episodes, all of these should be able to be used in any mission to some degree or other, although two of them will probably only be useful when working with a pre-made. First, I want to talk about a quick little healing trick that I'm kind of embarrassed that I forgot to mention earlier. You see, if you're low on health and you want to heal up, and you are not using your Cataclysm for anything super sensitive like defending a Kuva Siphon, you can just turn on Stasis and then drop a Cataclysm on a group of enemies from the Void. They will be safely brought into the Rift with you, and you can whack them until you're healed. This works with basically any form of healing, and is just a simple, quick, and safe trick that I really am surprised I haven't mentioned already. You can also use a variant of this for applying Rift Torrent, or just bringing enemies into the Void in general if you want to safely kill them. Next, let's cover an important thing about Stasis that you should be aware of, and the two tricks that you can derive from it. You see, if you cause a damage over time effect on an enemy that is either affected by Stasis, or apply it first and then activate Stasis, that effects in time will also be stasised, but the damage per second will not be. In other words, if you have a 40-second stasis, all damage over time effects you apply to a stasised enemy will gain an additional 40 seconds of duration. And since most dots last longer than it takes to cast stasis more than once, you can safely bump it past 2 minutes or probably more if the enemy is actually tanky enough to survive that long. Now this is nice for a couple of reasons. First, let's cover the more obvious one. If you have weapons that can apply even a decent strength damage over time effect quickly, you can just stasis an enemy as soon as he's affected and then leave him. He is now not only out of the fight, but also about to die very soon. So if you just keep stasis up all the time, all you need to do is say shoot a bombard a few times with something like the Akjagara, then immediately banish him to have what is effectively a 1-second kill time on an extremely tanky enemy. This works with any weapon that can apply strong dots regardless of its range or the type of dot. If you can somehow apply a strong enough fire effect to actually be worth using, you can use it with this. However, you should make sure nothing you banish like this will live for more than say 5 to 10 seconds or so. More than that can be a little annoying for your team and slow down survival missions. Also, while stasis will prevent anything that's banished from running around loose, be aware that Pug players sometimes respond quite horribly to seeing stasis statues even if those enemies are doomed and harmless, so you might want to just keep this trick for when playing with friends and guildmates. More on that unpleasant fact in a moment. But holding off on using this trick until then is usually quite fine, as most of the enemies that you actually would want to use this on will be really high level, such as what you'd run into in Kuva Floods, sorties, and long endless missions. Finally, this trick is mostly just for those with a low range setup. Limbos with a lot of excess range will have a ton of trouble hitting only the one enemy they're after, and while gas and AoE weapons can make this a little better, they won't necessarily stop you from accidentally banishing a few undamaged enemies. Now, the second thing about stasis dots that you should know is it can be used to create a life siphon. You see, life strike hits that apply damage over time effects give healing from those effects. This, combined with a long stasis duration, can be used to turn something like a bombard into a source of constant healing. So yeah, you can just smack a healthy enemy or two until you have 1 or 2 dots on them, apply stasis, and then just leave them there to gain a source of constant healing, one that does not have a range limitation, and can last just as long as those enemies do. Feel free to combine this with the life strike build I showed in the first video to make Limbo even more impossible to kill. However, as strong as this can be, it does have 3 big issues you'll need to work around. First, it really only starts to be helpful when playing higher level content. Enemies and earlier stuff tend to die too fast to be useful as life siphons, and while you can apply lighter bleeds to multiple enemies, any enemies you freeze cut into the total amount of foes that the game will allow on stage at once, so paralyzing a bunch of things can be just kind of rude to your teammates and kill your ability to finish the survival mission. In addition, it's often only around levels 50 to 60 that the tankier types of enemies start gaining enough health to be really worth using this on. All of that said, you probably don't have too many survivability issues at lower levels, so don't worry too much about that issue. The bigger problem is that teammates can kill your survivability. You see, since abilities can go through the void, even if your teammates aren't intentionally aiming for your indentured medic, he'll still go down very quickly if the fight gets near him. So if you do want to try this in a pug, you'll probably need to sneak off a bit from the group. Finally, Yeah. Pug Teammates in Limbo. Anyone who has played Limbo for long enough will be aware of how horrid some people can be towards him. And even seeing just one or two of paralyzed enemies that they think they can't harm is one of the fastest ways to trigger the worst of the Limbo haters. And yeah, that's likely to still be a thing post-stasis change. This is really frustrating when it happens, especially since if that guy is the host and he decides to rage quit, well, we all know how reliable host changes are in this game. His rage might have just aborted the mission for you and two innocent people. So, yeah. While this trick is pretty strong, none of the gameplay negatives actually affect your team in any way beyond having 2 or 3 less enemies to kill, and the only actual problem is something that someone else is causing. You would be the one triggering said problem. So, as infuriating as this is to say, unless you want to risk that lovely scenario, you might want to just keep this trick for when playing with friends. Now that we've got that lovely talk out of the way, let's move on to something that is solid, unlikely to annoy teammates, and is almost certainly a bug that will probably be removed from the game at some point. Exodia Contagion. For those of you who don't know, Exodia Contagion is a Zal arcane that can be gotten from the Plague Star events, and allows some of your mid-air attacks to launch an explosive bolt of viral energy when used after a bullet jump. On most frames, this is a pretty neat addition to their setups, but not particularly powerful. On Limbo, though, Exodia Contagion doesn't care about stasis or whether something is in the void or not. If you throw it out, it hits. So if you want, you can run around enjoying near immortality while tossing around a decent amount of damage. While the damage overall isn't all that great, it does land in a pretty large AoE and is affected by mods, and so can be pretty useful for clearing, say, groups of these shotgunners while remaining completely safe. That said, it does have a few issues. First, you're almost certainly going to own yourself in some way a few times when learning it. The AoE is very large and applies viral procs even to you, so yeah. Second, it's from Plague Star, and while it's actually surprisingly cheap for an event-only item, sometimes costing 30 plat or so a piece, that still means you either have to wait for another Plague Star event to happen, or be ready to shell out upwards of 300 platinum. Third, the ability to attack from the void is almost certainly a bug, and while that bug has been in the game for quite a long time and isn't all that overpowered considering when you're likely to get it, it still might be removed in any patch in the future, so yeah. And the final thing to mention is the mechanics of the Exodia itself. You see, first, obviously from the fact that it's AoE and it activates only after bullet jumps or double jumps, the ability to use this in something like, say, Grenier Corridors or any other place where you're basically forced into close range combat is just not particularly great. In addition, because it activates only after bullet jumps and double jumps, this drops its fire rate down to something around the same level as like the Corinth, which when added to its inability to work with the combo counter, the steep reduction of damage from firing if too close, and how difficult it is to make it useful against extremely high level armored enemies, you end up with something that, while it's safe and has some tactical value at times, still ends up doing less damage overall than you might get from just going in with a melee weapon. So while Exodia Contagion is very good and worth considering, especially with a covert lethality setup, it isn't necessarily better for Limbo than the other Exodias. It's just that he can use it far better than most other Warframes can. Anyways, this might just be the last video on Limbo combat tricks. There probably are some things that just aren't popping into my head at the moment, and if I or someone in the comment section thinks of them, I'll make an episode for. But at the moment, I'm thinking I might just be able to move on to another part of the Limbo experience. As always, if you've liked the video or learned something new, please leave a like and subscribe, and I will see you later. Farewell.